Okay, number three for this afternoon or evening, if you are further east of us. Japan and India will respond robustly to China's expansionist policies. And now, here, the reason we came to this conclusion is a staggering development this month. China doubled its defense budget from 1% to 2% of the GDP. The proposed increase would total about 287 billion over the next 5 years. In comparison, Japan's fiscal budget in comparison to Japan's defense budget for the fiscal year that ends in March 2023 is $39.66 billion. By March 2028, the Japanese annual defense budget would be $80 billion. So over to you, Glenn, since you're friends with the Japanese defense attaché, Major General Hiroyuki Suge, who's also friends with me, but you've spoken to the Japanese, you've hung out with the Japanese, you've dealt with the Japanese, you write a column in Newsweek Japan. So over to you.
Well, yeah, I mean, depending on exchange rates and which reliable source one consults, the figures that you cited and the ones that I have vary a little, but the point is that it's a doubling of the defense budget from 1% to 2% of Japan's GDP. Whether it's up to 80 billion or 100 billion is almost secondary. It will make Japan's military the third most strongly funded in the world. Japan has contracted to purchase 500 Tomahawk missiles. Now, what that means is that Japan has always said, and the U.S. has always insisted since World War II, that Japan's military capabilities be only defensive in nature. They could respond to an attack and protect their islands, but they could not project their power. That's always been a false distinction to some extent. Although Japanese defense officials I met with a number of times have said to me in frustration, and it was a telling comment. They said, you, the United States, have allowed us to shoot down from our ships, meaning anti-submarine capabilities, but not out from our ships to project our power and our against a ship or anyone else. That is now changing. The Tomahawk missile can fly 1,000 kilometers, I think, range. I forget what the range is, but it allows Japan to project power. When you add to that a strong shift, surprisingly, of public opinion.
Stupid question from me, Glenn. Can they strike mainland China with Tomahawks?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. How far inland, I don't know, but hundreds of kilometers, certainly. Yeah.
So they could hit Shanghai, they could hit their ports.
Yes. Yes. There's now a majority of Japanese population that supports the increase in the defense budget, that supports the change in Japan's defense posture, which has extended to consider an attack on Taiwan as an existential threat to Japan. This is, in China's view, quite an aggressive thing to say. And there's a dramatic change in the posture of the Japanese defense world from just recent years. Japan is building, with U.S. help, 2 aircraft carriers, and we'll have them and more under construction by the year 2030. This is the first time since World War II that Japan will have had this. Japan now has more F-135s, one of the 2 most capable aircraft on Earth, the other being the F-22, and has more of them than any other country in the world than the United States. As I said, Japan is extending its defensive strategic interests to embrace the sovereignty of Taiwan. A non-military measure, but of strategic defense importance. Japan took the initiative under Shinzo Abe and has continued it in Africa with robust, dramatic. We're talking near $100 billion level effort of aid to Africa, specifically to counter China's strategic investments of hundreds of billions of dollars in Africa. The level does not measure up to that of China. The resources are not there, but it is consequential, and it has drawn the United States actually along, which I think is a very good thing. Japan is showing strategic defense-related initiatives. I'll turn over to you for India. The reason I think this issue, Japan and India's response to China's rise, is a signal event for 2023. It really is, because it really extends beyond 2023. This is not even an issue of war and peace in Ukraine. Critical as that is, this will affect the nature of the geostrategic equations for many, many years to come. But India is one of the two critical players in this.
Speaking of India, I'll hand it over to you very soon. But India is a country that is taking on China physically. At the moment, even as I speak, as we speak, we have thousands of troops across the 3,500 plus kilometer border. In fact, you and I authored a long piece along with Vikram Sood, the former chief of India's intelligence agency, about the India-China conflict. And a lot of the things we analyzed hold true today. India is building border infrastructure for the first time at scale. So far, the fear was that if we build roads, then the Chinese will use them to come straight down to the plains. Now, India has the confidence to build the border infrastructure, to beef up its posts. Its soldiers get into a bish bash bosh with the Chinese. In fact, the Chinese get a beating each time they pick a fight. As per some of our friends in different countries, this whole policy by Xi Jinping to make Chinese boys more manly came because they got beaten up in the border clash, which triggered our article a couple of years ago. So India is already taking on China physically. Now that, apart from border infrastructure, apart from physically taking them on, India, in its own crazy, chaotic, dysfunctional way, is moving in an elephantine manner to be more assertive. There is a new nationalism in India. There is a desire not to go along with the Nehruvian appeasement of China. Jawaharlal Nehru signed away Tibet to China. I remember when we were editing the article, at some point, you came across a historical document and commented in the margins, "What an idiot." And in some ways, when you look back with the benefit of hindsight, a lot of Nehruvian decisions were idiotic. It's not that we will not do something idiotic today or stupid today, but there is this desire to correct Nehruvian Hindi Chini Bhai Bhai, which literally means India-China brotherhood. Very importantly, something that people have not noticed in the West much. I've written about it. My last article was about it with Manu Sharma. It's about how India is now promoting, or rather protecting, Tibetan Buddhism against Chinese aggression. I mean, China's policy China's policy is very simple. It is to cause the destruction of Tibetan culture, settling ethnic Chinese, Han Chinese in Tibet, and it also wants to install a puppet when the Dalai Lama dies. And India is very clear that India wants to protect Tibetan Buddhism as it exists. India wants to make sure that in a post-Dalai Lama world, Tibet survives as a cultural entity, if not as a political entity. And therefore, the fight for Tawang, which is the only bit of old Tibet that India which has the oldest monastery in China, it assumes great importance. And what we are seeing is that clash on the border, which just happened in Tawang, take place. Now, you can talk more about India's development of the Blue Water Navy. You can talk more about India's reluctant adoption of the US-led post-war norms-based order, and I'll hand you over to that.
Yeah, I think that the issues specifically on the border are significant, but in a sense are not qualitatively changing. India has always attempted to defend its borders. It can do so more competently and is doing so more aggressively in the face of a more aggressive China than before. But I see even larger changes. India, as it becomes progressively an economic powerhouse, a global power, is developing a blue water navy, which means a navy that can project power beyond. And specifically, the concerns for India are the Indian Ocean, the Malacca Straits, the Persian Gulf, and even into Asia itself, the South China and East China Seas progressively. It's doing more.
And India did do naval exercises in South China Sea. It docked in Vietnam, if I remember correctly.
Yes. It has become a member of the Quad. The Quad is to remind people of Japan, Australia, the United States, and India, 4 countries getting together for initially coordinating supply chain issues, pharmaceutical distribution and development, but also strategic defense-related matters, since supply chain is critical to defense. And then one segues progressively into actually joint military planning and so on. That's a step further, perhaps, than one can say the Quad directly engages in yet, but not far. India is engaging in progressively substantial and deep joint arms production agreements with the United States and other countries as India works to develop its own indigenous independent arms industry. And notably, something hardly anyone has paid attention to, because who cares about Armenia? But India, one should, certainly Armenians, but India has signed a substantial arms deal to provide weapons, hundreds, I think $500 million worth, to Armenia. This is a projection of power and geostrategic engagement that one has not seen from India before. These trends are rising, notable, and strategic in response to China's increasingly assertive policies, but also a function of India's own rise to global power. And largely, this is an important point, largely in support, of course, first of Indian national interests as it perceives them, but second, because India fundamentally does subscribe to a normative order more clearly than China, which seems to want to define the international order rather than from Washington, but from Beijing, and who would not if you were Chinese, I suppose. But India's change is different, which then gets to my last point, and before I turn over to you again, Atul, is India is criticized frequently by the United States for not playing, well, it continues to buy oil from Russia, for example. It's not supporting the normative international order. But I think the large point here in international relations is that what has been unique about the post-World War II Pax Americana normative international order is that American interests have aligned with large international norms. It has benefited America, and so therefore the US can support these international norms. It was similar in the Pax Britannica in the 19th century, which supported, on the whole, free trade. Similarly, India, as its interests align progressively in international trade and strategic issues, India's policies will become more directly supportive of, quote, normative, unquote, policies than has been the case before. For now, it makes perfect sense, really, that India say, well, look, we need to buy oil from Russia because if we don't, our economy will collapse. But when it becomes more able to produce its own energy, as it's aggressively working to do, then you'll see India can literally afford and figuratively afford and substantively will embrace more aggressive actions in support of the, quote, normative international order.
Well, you've hit the hammer on the nail. Look, India has to buy Russian oil for many reasons. One, of course, is, as you said, its economy may collapse. Then there is this simple fact that its per capita annual income is just $2,256.6 as per the World Bank as of last year. So the poor in India cannot take inflation. I mean, the poor in England suffer as well, in Scotland and Northern Ireland, and therefore there is this real crisis in the UK, which is why you have constant pressure on the Prime Minister, the Chancellor, and others. But in India, you'd get voted out. So if you want political self-preservation, you've got to limit inflation. And no Christmas votes for Turkey, and therefore no politician is going to vote for importing inflation. And in fact, the ruling Bharatiya Janata Party is far more pro-American than any other Indian party because it is naturally free market. The more left-leaning parties, especially, for instance, the Congress Party, was deeply infiltrated by the Soviets, as you well know. You know it much better than me, Glenn. So India has its own compulsions to buy Russian oil for economic reasons, but there's also the old relationship that Russia has sold India a lot of military equipment. It was cheaper. So now India needs spare parts, so it's locked in. And then also India wants technology transfer, which is something that the US is reticent about because the US legal and economic system is very different. Intellectual property rights are sacrosanct. Whilst India comes from the same point as the US is with its new industrial policy that, hang on a minute, we must have technological capability. But these, as you rightly say, are minor kinks to iron out. Broadly, because of China, India and the US are going to be more aligned. Because of China, India and Japan will have to move, despite their cultural differences, will have to move more closely together. And we will see India and Japan rise up to the challenge from China, their biggest and most powerful neighbor that is treading on their toes. And in 2023, we will see this emerge in clearer colors.
Okay, I'm afraid that I lost everyone for a moment. Either the Chinese or the Russians were offended by me, it seems. But I am back.
Brilliant. So we just concluded our third section. Any final words of wisdom for 2023? You're not going to tell people to take cold showers or buy stocks, I hope.
No, I'm relatively optimistic about 2023. I think it'll be the strains will continue in China, but China will muddle through without dramatic issues, although tougher economic situation. I think the war will continue to muddle, I think, as you say, but strains increasing on Russia.
Brilliant. On that note, everyone, have a wonderful rest of your 2023. Enjoy the holiday season and Happy New Year. We will see you in January. All the best. Bye for now.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.